Okay, cool. I'm reading chapter 28. I'm on page 638. Probably reading page 650. And I haven't tried to read with these braces on. Yeah, it's not gonna sound great. That's okay. My speed may be significantly decreased. I may have a bit of a lisp kind of going on. You never know. Whatever, I got this. Let's go. Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt. Nearly 76 million Americans greeted the new century in 1900. Almost 1 in 7 of them was foreign-born. In the 14 years of peace that remained before the Great War in 1914 engulfed the globe, 13 million more migrants carried their bundles down the gangplanks to the land of promise. Hardly had the 20th century dawned on... It's so bad. Ow, I'm hurting my lips. Let me try that again. Hardly had the 20th century dawned on the ethnically and racially mixed American people than they were convulsed by a reform movement, the likes of which the nation had not seen since the 1840s. The New Crusaders, who called themselves progressives, waged the war on many evils, notably monopoly, corruption, inefficiency, and social injustice. The Progressive Army was large, diverse, and widely deployed, but it had a single battle cry: strengthen the state. The real heart of the movement, explained one of the progressive reformers, was to use government as an agency of human welfare. Progressive roots. The groundswell of new reformist wave went far back, to the Greenback Labor Party of the 1870s and the Populists of the 1890s, to the mounting unrest throughout the land as grasping industrialists concentrated more and more on power in fewer and fewer hands. An outworn philosophy of hands-off individualism seemed increasingly out of place in the modern machine age. Social and economic problems were now too complex for the internationally feeble Jeffersonian organs of government. Progressive theorists were insisting that society could no longer afford the luxury of limitless, let alone laissez-faire policy. The people, through government, must substitute mastery for drift. Well before 1900, prospective politicians and writers had begun to pinpoint targets for progressive attack. Brian Attgeld and the Populists loudly branded the bloated trust with the stigma of corruption and wrongdoing. In 1894, Henry Demarest Lloyd charged headlong into Standard Oil Company with his book Wealth Against Commonwealth. Eccentric Thorstein Veblen assailed New Rich with his prickly pen in The Theory of the Leisure Class, a savage attack on the predatory wealth and conspicuous consumption. In Veblen's view on a parasitic leisure class engaged in wasteful business, or making money for money's sake, rather than productive industry, or making goods to satisfy real needs, he urged that social leadership pass from these superfluous titans to truly useful engineers. Other pen-wielding knights likewise entered the fray. The keen-eyed and keen-nosed Danish immigrant Jacob A. Riis, a reporter for the New York Sun, shocked middle-class Americans in 1890 with how the other half lives. His account was a damning indictment of the dirt, disease, vice, and misery of the rat-gnawed human rookeries known as New York slums. The book deeply influenced the future New York City police commissioner, Theodore Roosevelt. Novelist Theodore Dreiser used his blunt prose to batter promoters and profiteers in The Financier and The Titan. Caustic critics of social injustice issued from several other corners. Socialists, many of whom were European immigrants inspired by the strong movement for state socialism in the Old World, began to register appreciable strength at the ballot box. High-minded messengers of the social gospel promoted a brand of progressivism based on Christian teachings. They used religious doctrine to demand better housing and living conditions for the urban poor. University-based economists urged new reforms modeled on European examples, importing policy ideas from Berlin to Baltimore. Feminists in multiplying numbers added social justice to suffrage on their list of needed reforms, with urban pioneers like Jane Addams in Chicago and Lillian Wald in New York blazing the way. Women entered the fight to improve the lot of families living and working in the festering cities. Raking muck with the muckrakers. Beginning about 1902, the exposing view became a flourishing industry among American publishers. A group of aggressive 10 and 15-cent popular magazines surged to the front, notably McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, and Everybody's. Waging fierce circulation wars, they dug deep for dirt that the public loved to hate. Enterprising editors financed extensive research and encouraged pugnacious writers by their bright young reporters, whom President Roosevelt branded as muckrakers in 1906. Annoyed by their excessive zeal, he compared the mudslinging magazine dirt diggers to the figure in Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress, who was so intent on raking manure that he could not see the celestial crown dangling overhead. Despite presidential scolding, these muckrakers boomed circulation, and some of their most scandalous exposures were published as best-selling books. The reformer writers ranged far and wide and deep in their crusade to lay bare the muck of inquiry in the American society. iniquity. Sorry, not inquiry, iniquity. In 1902, a brilliant New York reporter, Lincoln Steffens, announced a series of articles in McClure's titled The Shame of the Cities. He fearlessly unmasked the corrupt alliance between big business and municipal government. Steffens was followed by the same magazine by Ida M. Tarbell, a pioneering journalist who published a devastating but factual expose of the Standard Oil Company. Her father had been ruined by the oil interests. Plucky muckrakers fearlessly tilted their pen lances at varied targets. They assailed the malpractices of life insurance companies and tariff lobbies. They roasted the beef trust, the money trust, the railroad barons, the corrupt amassing of American fortunes. Thomas W. Lawson, an erratic speculator who had himself made $50 million on the stock market, laid bare the practices of his accomplices in frenzied finance, a series of articles that appeared in Everybody's. Lawson, by fouling his own nest, made many enemies among his rich associates, and he died a poor man. David G. Phillips shocked an already startled nation by his series of in the Cosmopolitan entitled The Treason of the Senate. He boldly charged that 75 of the 90 senators did not represent the people, but all but the railroads and the trusts. This withering indictment, buttressed by facts, impressed President Roosevelt. Phillips continued his attacks through novels and was fatally shot in 1911 by a deranged young man whose family had allegedly maligned. Some of the most effective fire of the muckrakers was directed at social evils. The ugly list included the immoral white slave traffic in women, the rickety slums, and the appalling number of industrial accidents. The sorry subjugation of America's 9 million blacks, of whom 90% still lived in the South and 1/3 were illiterate, was spotlighted in race standard bakers following the color line. The abuses of child labor were brought luridly to light by the John Spargo's The Bitter Cry of the Children. Vendors of potent patent machines, often heavily spiked with alcohol, likewise came in for bitter criticism. These conscienceless vultures sold incredible quantities of adulterated or habit-forming drugs, while doping the press with lavish advertising. Muckraking attacks and Collier's were ably reinforced by Dr. Harvey W. Wiley, chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture, who with his famous poison squad performed experiments on himself. Full of sound and fury, the muckrakers signified much about the nature of the progressive reform movement. They were long on the lamentation, but stopped short of revolutionary remedies. To right social wrongs, they counted on publicity and an aroused public conscience, not drastic political change. They sought not to overthrow capitalism, but to cleanse it. The cure for their ills of American democracy, they earnestly believed, was more democracy. Oh my goodness. I'm doing my best. I think that these words are actively scratching me as I speak. But that's okay. I'm all good. Political progressivism. The question, who were the progressives, evokes contradictory answers. Progressive reformers included militarists such as Theodore Roosevelt, who thrilled the strenuous life, as well as pacifists such as Jane Addams, whose loftiest goals included the abolition of war. Female settlement workers, hoping to Americanize recent immigrants, mobilized alongside labor unionists and enlightened businessmen to strengthen the helping hand of government. In diverse ways, and sometimes with divergent aims, the progressives sought to modernize American institutions to achieve two chief goals: to use the state to curb monopoly power and to improve the common person's conditions of life and labor. Progressives emerged in both major parties, in all regions, and at all levels of government. The truth is that progressivism was a less monolithic minority movement and a more broadly dispersed majority mood. One of the first objectives of progressives was to regain the power that had slipped from the hands of the people into those of the interests. These ardent reformers pushed for direct primary elections so as to undercut power-hungry party bosses. They favored the initiative so that voters could directly propose legislation themselves, thus bypassing the boss-bought state legislators. Progressives also agitated for the referendum. This device would paste laws on the ballot for final approval by the people, especially laws that had been railroaded through a compliant legislator by free-spending agents of big businesses. The recall would enable the voters to remove faithless elected officials, particularly those who had been bribed by bosses or lobbyists. Rooting out graft also became a prime goal of the earnest progressives. A number of the state legislators passed Corrupt Practices Acts, which limited the amount of money that candidates could spend for their election. Such legislation also restricted the huge gifts from corporations, for which the donors would not expect special favors. The secret Australian ballot was likewise being introduced more widely in the states to counteract boss rule. Bribery was less feasible, and bribers could not tell if they were getting their money's worth from the bribed. Direct election of U.S. senators became a favorite goal of progressives, especially after the muckrakers had exposed the scandalous intimacy between greedy corporations and Congress. By 1900, the Senate had so many rich men that it was often sneered at as the Millionaires' Club. Too many of these prosperous solons, elected as they then were by trust-dominated legislators, heeded the voice of their masters rather than the voice of the masses. A constitutional amendment to bring about the popular election of senators had rough sledding in Congress, for the plutocratic members of the Senate were happy with existing methods. But a number of states established primary elections in which voters express their preferences for the Senate. The local legislators, when choosing senators, found it politically wise to heed the voice of the people. Partly as a result of such pressures, the 17th Amendment of the Constitution, approved in 1913, established a direct election of U.S. senators. But the expected improvement in the caliber was slow in coming. Women's suffrage, the goal of female reformers for many decades, likewise received powerful new support from the progressives early in the 1900s. The political reformers believed that women's votes would elevate the political tone, and the foes of the saloon felt that they could count on the support of enfranchised females. The suffragists, with their cry of votes for women and equal suffrage for men and women, protested bitterly against taxation without representation. Many of the states, especially the more liberal ones in the West, such as Washington, California, and Oregon, gradually extended the vote to women. But by 1910, nationwide female suffrage was still a decade away, and the suffragist could still be sneeringly defined as one who has ceased to be a lady and has not yet become a gentleman. Okay, progressivism in the cities. Teeth. Okay, in the cities and states. Progressives scored some of their most impressive gains in the cities. Frustrated by the inefficiency and corruption of machine-oiled city government, many localities followed the pioneering example of Galveston, Texas. In 1901, it appointed expert staff commissions to manage urban affairs. Other communities adopted the city manager system, also designed to take politics out of municipal administration. Some of these reforms obviously valued efficiency more highly than democracy, as control of civic affairs was further removed from the people's hands. Urban reformers likewise attacked slumlords, juvenile delinquency, and wide-open prostitution, vice at a price, which flourished in red light districts unchallenged by bribed police. Public-spirited Americans looked to English and German cities for lessons on how to clean up their water supplies, light their streets, and run their trolley cars. The vogue of public ownership of utilities swept the nation as local governments tried to halt the corruption sale of franchises. Progressivism naturally bubbled up to a state level, notably in Wisconsin, which became a UC's laboratory of reform. The governor of the state, Pompadour Robert M. Fighting Bob Lafayette, was an undersized but overbearing crusader who emerged as the most militant of the progressive Republican leaders. After a desperate fight with the entrenched monopoly, he had reached the governor's chair in 1901. Routing the lumber and railroad interests, he wrestled considerable control from the crooked corporations and returned it to the people. He also perfected a scheme for regulating public utilities, while laboring in close association with experts on the faculty of the State University at Madison. Other states marched steadily towards the progressive camp as they undertook to regulate railroads and trusts, chiefly through public utility commissions. Oregon was not far behind Wisconsin, and California made giant boot strides under the stocky Hiram W. Johnson. Elected Republican governor in 1910, this dynamic prosecutor of grafters helped break the dominant grip of the Southern Pacific Railroad on California politics, and then, like Follett, set up a political machine of his own. Heavily whiskered Charles Evans Hughes, the able and audacious reformist Republican governor of New York, had earlier gained national fame as an investigator of malpractices by gas and insurance companies and by the Coal Trust. Progressive women. Wait one sec. Women proved themselves as an indispensable part of the Progressive Army. A crucial focus for women's activities was the settlement house movement. At a time when women could neither vote nor hold political office, settlement houses offered a side door to public life. They exposed middle-class women to the problems plaguing America's cities, including poverty, political corruption, and intolerable working and living conditions. They also gave them the skills and the confidence to attack those evils. The women's club movement provided an even broader civic entryway for many middle-class women. Literary clubs where educated women meant to improve themselves with poetry and prose had existed for decades, but in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, many of these clubs set aside Shakespeare and Henry James for the social issues and current events. Dante has been dead for several centuries, observed the president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs in 1904. I think it is time that we drop the study of his Inferno and turned our attention to our own. 19th century notions of separate spheres dictated that a woman's place was in the home, so most female progressives defended their new activities as an extension, not a rejection, of the traditional roles of wife and mother. Thus, they were often drawn to moral and maternal issues, like keeping children out of smudgy mills and sweltering sweatshops, attacking the scourge of tuberculosis bred in airless tenements, winning pensions for mothers with dependent children, and ensuring that only safe food products found their way to the family table. Female activists agitated through organizations like National Consumers League and the Women's Trade Union League, as well as through two new federal agencies, the Children's Bureau and the Women's Bureau, both in the Department of Labor. These wedges into the federal bureaucracy, however small, gave female reformers a national stage for social investigation and advocacy. Campaigns for factory reform and temperature particularly attracted women and foot soldiers. Unsafe and unsanitary sweatshops, factories where workers toiled long hours for low wages, were a public scandal in many cities. Florence Kelley, a former resident of Jane Addams' Hull House, became the state of Illinois' first chief factory inspector and one of the nation's leading advocates for improved factory conditions. In 1899, Kelley took control of the newly founded National Consumers League, which mobilized female consumers to pressure for laws safeguarding women and children in the workplace. In the landmark case Muller v. Oregon, crusading attorneys Louis D. Brandeis persuaded the Supreme Court to accept the constitutionality of laws protecting women workers by presenting evidence of the harmful effects of factory labor on women's weaker bodies. Although this argument calling for special protection for women seemed discriminatory by later standards and closed many male jobs to women, progressives at the time hailed Brandeis' achievement as a triumph over existing legal doctrine, which afforded employers total control over the workplace. The American welfare state that emerged from female activism focused more on protecting women and children than granting benefits to everyone, as was the case in much of Western Europe, with its stronger labor movements. Crusaders for these humane measures did not always have smooth sailing. One dismaying setback came in 1905 when the Supreme Court, in Lochner v. New York, invalidated a New York law establishing a 10-day hour for bakers. Yet the reformist progressive wave finally washed up into the judiciary, and in 1917 the court upheld a 10-hour law for factory workers. Laws regulating factories were worthless if not enforced, a truth horribly demonstrated by a lethal fire in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City. Locked doors and other flagrant violations of the fire code turned up the factory in a death trap. 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, were incinerated or leapt from 8th and 9th story windows to their deaths. Oh my god. That word, I just said deaths. Deaths. Lashed by public outcry, including a massive strike by women in the needle trades, the New York legislature passed much stronger laws regulating the hours and conditions of sweatshop toil. Other legislators followed, and by 1917, 30 states had put workers' compensation laws on the books, providing insurance to workers injured in industrial accidents. Gradually, the concept of the employer's responsibility to society was replacing the old dog-eat-dog philosophy of unregulated free enterprise. Corner saloons, with their shuttered doors, naturally attracted the ire and fire of progressives. Alcohol was intimately connected with the prostitution in red-light districts, with the drunken voter, with the crooked city officials dominated by booze interests, and with the blousy boss who counted poker chips by night and miscounted ballots by day, including the cemetery vote. By 1900, cities like New York and San Francisco had one saloon for about every 200 people. Anti-liquor campaigners received powerful support from several militant organizations, notably the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Prayer on Saloon Floors, founder Frances E. Willard, who would fall to her knees in prayer on saloon floors, mobilized nearly 1 million women to make the world homelike, and built the WCTU into the largest organization of women in the world. She found a vigorous ally in the Anti-Saloon League, which was aggressive, well-organized, and well-financed. Caught up in the Crusades, some states and numerous counties passed dry laws, which controlled, restricted, or abolished alcohol. The big cities were generally wet, for they had a large immigrant vote custom in the old country to free the flow of wine and beer. When World War I erupted in 1914, nearly one-half of the population lived in dry territory, and nearly three-fourths of the total area had outlawed saloons. Demon Realm was groggy and about to be floored, temporarily by the 18th Amendment in 1919. Okay, sorry, I spit all over my mouth. T.R. Square deal for labor. Theodore Roosevelt, although something of an imperialistic busybody abroad, was touched by the progressive wave at home. Like other reformers, he feared that the public interest was being submerged in the drifting seas of indifference. Everybody's interest was nobody's interest. Roosevelt decided to make it his. His sportsman's instincts spurred him into demanding a square deal for capital, labor, and the public at large. Broadly speaking, the president's program embraced the 3 C's: control of corporations, consumer protection, and the conservation of natural resources. The Square Deal for Labor received its acid test in 1902 when a crippling strike broke out in the anthracite coal mines of Pennsylvania. Some 140,000 besuited workers, many of them illiterate immigrants, had long been frightfully exploited and accident-plagued. They demanded, among other improvements, a 20% increase in pay and a reduction of the working day from 10 to 9 hours. Unsympathetic mine owners, confident that a chilled public would react against the miners, refused to arbitrate or even negotiate. One of their spokesmen, multimillionaire George F. Baer, reflected the high and mighty attitude of certain ungenerous employers. Workers, he wrote, would be cared for not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God in his infinite wisdom has given the control of the property interests of this country. As coal supplies dwindled, factories and schools were forced to shut down, and even hospitals felt the icy grip of winter. Desperately seeking a solution, Roosevelt summoned the representatives of the striking miners and the mine owners to the White House. He was profoundly annoyed by the extraordinary stupidity and bad temper of the wooden-headed gentry who operated the mines. As he later confessed, if it had not been for the dignity of his high office, he would have taken one of them by the seat of the breeches and chucked him out the window. Roosevelt finally resorted to his trusty big stick when he threatened to seize the mines and operate them with federal troops. Faced with his first time ever threat to use federal bayonets against capital rather than labor, the owners begrudgingly consented to arbitration. A compromise decision ultimately gave the miners a 10% pay boost and a working day of 9 hours, but their union was not officially recognized as a bargaining agent. Keenly aware of the mounting antagonism between capital and labor, Roosevelt urged Congress to create the new Department of Commerce and Labor. This goal was achieved in 1903. 10 years later, the agency was split in two. An important arm of the newborn cabinet body was the Bureau of Corporations, which was authorized to probe businesses engaged in interstate commerce. The Bureau was highly useful in helping to break the stranglehold of monopoly and in clearing the road for the era of trust busting. TR roused corporations. The sprawling railroad octopus sorely needed restraint. The Interstate Commerce Commission, created in 1887 as a feeble stop to the public, had proved woefully inadequate. Railroad barons could simply appeal the Commission's decisions on rates to federal courts, a process that might take 10 years. Spurred by the former cowboy president, Congress passed effective railroad legislation, beginning with the Elkins Act of 1903. This curb was aimed primarily at the rebate evil. Heavy fines could now be imposed both on the railroads that gave rebates on the shippers that accepted them. Still more effective was the Hepburn Act of 1906. Free passes, with their hint of bribery, were severely restricted. The once infantile Interstate Commerce Commission was expanded, and its reach was extended to include express companies, sleeping car companies, and pipelines. For the first time, the Commission was given real knowledge when it was authorized on complaint of shippers to nullify existing rates and stipulate maximum rates. Railroads also provided Roosevelt with an opportunity to brandish his antitrust bludgeon. Trust had come to be a fighting word in the progressive era. Roosevelt believed that these industrial behemoths, with their efficient means of production, had arrived to stay. He concluded that there were good trusts, with public consciences, and bad trusts, which lusted greedily for power. He was determined to respond to the popular outcry against trust, but was also determined not to throw out the baby with the bathwater by indiscriminately smashing all large businesses. Roosevelt, as a trust buster, first busted into the headlines in 1902 with an attack on the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company organized by financial titan J.P. Morgan and empire builder James J. Hill. These Napoleonic moguls of money sought to achieve a virtual monopoly of the railroads in the Northwest. Roosevelt was therefore challenging the most regal potentates of the industrial aristocracy. The railway promoters appealed to the Supreme Court, which in 1904 upheld Roosevelt's antitrust suit and ordered the Northern Securities Company to be dissolved. The Northern Securities decision jolted Wall Street and angered big business, but greatly enhanced Roosevelt's reputation as a trust smasher. Roosevelt's big stick crashed down on other giant monopolies as he initiated over 40 legal proceedings against them. The Supreme Court in 1905 declared the beef trust illegal, and the heavy fist of justice fell upon monopolists controlling sugar, fertilizer, harvesters, and other key products. Much mythology has inflated Roosevelt's reputation as a trust buster. The Rough Rider understood the political popularity of monopoly smashing, but he did not consider it sound economic policy. Combination and integration, he felt, were the hallmarks of the age, and to try to stem the tide of economic progress by political means he considered the rankest folly. Bigness was not necessarily badness, so why punish success? Roosevelt's real purpose in assaulting the Goliath of the industry was symbolic, to prove conclusively that the government, not private business, ruled the country. He believed in regulating, not fragmenting, and the big business combines the threat. And the big business combines. The threat of disillusion, he felt, might make the sultans of the smokestacks more amenable to federal regulation, as it did. In truth, Roosevelt never swung his trust-crushing stick with maximum force. In many ways, the huge industrial behemoths were healthier, though perhaps the more tame, at the end of Roosevelt's reign than they had been before. His successor, William Howard Taft, actually busted more trust than TR did. In one celebrated instance in 1907, Roosevelt even gave his personal blessing to J.P. Morgan's plan to have U.S. Steel absorb the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company without fear of antitrust reprisals. When Taft then launched a suit against U.S. Steel in 1911, the political reaction from TR was explosive. Okay, I think that's all I'll read. I'm going to take a nice break now.